The pianoforte in Mrs. Holloway's front parlor had been out of tune since Christmas, and Clemency Ware had been listening to it go wrong for 11 minutes before she was permitted to touch it. She sat on the edge of a hard chair by the window, with her hands folded in her lap, and her tuning hammer in the flat black case on the floor beside her ankle, and she listened while the eldest Miss Holloway played her piece. It was a set of variations, and the girl played them well enough, and every time her right hand came down on the E above middle C, the whole instrument shivered a little the way a man shivers when he has stood too long in a wet coat. Nobody else in the room heard it. Mrs. Holloway sat by the fire with her netting and nodded in time. The younger girls whispered on the sofa. The fire spat. Outside on Weil Cop, the February rain came down on Shrewsbury in that thin grey way it has in the middle of the afternoon when the light gives up early, and a carter's horse went by with the sound of iron on wet stone. The E above middle C was flat by rather less than a comma. Its middle string was flat. The other two were not. That was all. And it had been all for a month and a half, and it was the sort of small persistent wrongness that gets into a house without anyone knowing why the music has stopped being a pleasure. The girl finished. Her mother said it was charming. Clemency said nothing at all, because she had learned at 19 that a tuner who volunteers an opinion is a tuner who is not asked back. Then Mrs. Holloway said, in the voice of a woman conferring a favor, that Miss Ware might now do whatever it was she did, and please to be finished by 5, and Clemency knelt down and opened her case. There were 3 tuning forks in it, laid in their velvet beds like surgical instruments. They had been her father's. There was a hammer with a rosewood handle worn pale where his thumb had gone, and a set of rubber wedges, and a small folded cloth, and a stub of pencil, and nothing else in the world that she owned outright except the clothes she stood in, and a garnet cross in a drawer at home. She took the front board off the instrument, and the noise of the room fell away from her, the way it always did. This was the thing about Clemency Ware that no one in Shrewsbury had ever quite known what to do with. She was 23, slender, of medium height, with dark red-brown hair that she parted in the center and coiled low at the nape, because it was cheaper than curling it, and grey-green eyes, and a fair freckled complexion that no amount of Denmark lotion had ever mended, and she was the daughter of a dead man who had tuned every good instrument between Shrewsbury and Ludlow. And she could hear. Not merely well. She could hear the way other people see, immediately in detail, without effort, and without the smallest ability to explain how it was done. When she was 7, her father had held a fork to the table and asked her what it was. And she had told him, and he had gone quite still and asked her again with a different fork, and again, and by the end of an hour he was sitting on the floor of the workshop with his hands over his mouth and his eyes wet, laughing at her. Perfect pitch, he told her afterwards. It comes to about 1 in 10,000, Clem, and God has gone and put it in a girl in Shropshire who will never be paid a farthing for it. He had been very nearly right about that. He had also been wrong, in a way neither of them could have guessed, and the whole of what followed came out of the one afternoon when he had been wrong. She worked through the middle of the instrument first, laying her wedges, sounding the fork, letting the beat slow and stop. Behind her the girls whispered about a militia officer. The fire settled. Her fingers went numb at the tips because the parlor was cold at the window, and she warmed them under her arms twice and went on, and by 10 minutes to 5 the E above middle C had stopped shivering, and the whole instrument had come back into itself and stood there sounding like something worth having. Mrs. Halloway paid her 4 shillings in the hall and asked whether that was not rather a great deal. Clemency said that it was the same 4 shillings it had been in her father's time, and thanked her, and put on her bonnet, and went out into the rain. She walked home up the hill with the case bumping her shin. 4 shillings. She had 2 more instruments promised for the week, and the organ at St. Julian's on Friday, for which the churchwardens paid her 7 6 a quarter and complained about it. Set against that there was the rent of 2 rooms over Mr. Boucher's stationer's shop in Fish Street, and coal at 1 and 8 the hundredweight, and her aunt. Her Aunt Prudence was 61, and had worked point lace for 40 years, and had in the last 3 of them gone almost entirely blind at close range, which is what happens to women who work point lace for 40 years. She could see a door. She could not see a thread. She sat by the window all day with her hands in her lap and her face turned to the light, and she was cheerful about it, in a way that Clemency found harder to bear than complaint would have been. When Clemency came in and shook the water off her bonnet, her aunt said at once, before hello, that a letter had come. There was no fire lit. There was a letter on the table, propped against the tin, and it was a real letter, not a bill, heavy-laid paper, folded and sealed with a red wafer, and directed in a clerk's copperplate to Miss Clemency Ware, at Mr. Boucher's Fish Street, Shrewsbury. Clemency lit the candle first, because she had learned not to hurry at things that might disappoint her. Then she broke the seal. Chambers of Mr. Josiah Quillen, attorney, in the High Street, Bridgenorth. Madam, it is my duty to acquaint you that you are named in the last will and testament of Ambrose Ferrand, late of Quat Bank in this county, Bellfounder, deceased on the 9th instant. Your attendance at my chambers on Thursday the 20th at 11 in the forenoon is respectfully requested, when the will shall be read. I am, madam, your obedient servant. She read it twice. Then she sat down on the hard chair by the table, still in her wet cloak. Her aunt said, "Well, and what is it?" "It is a mistake," Clemency said. She said it because it was the only thing that made sense. She did not know any Ambrose Ferrand. She had never in her life been to Quat Bank, wherever Quat Bank was, and she was tolerably certain she had never met a Bellfounder, and the notion that a dead stranger should have written her name into a will was so far outside the shape of her life that her mind simply put it down as an error of clerking, the way one puts down a wrong note. And then, sitting there with the rain going down the window and the candle guttering in the draught from the ill-fitting sash, she remembered a hot day and a churchyard and a man in a brown coat, and she went cold all over. She had been 15. Her father had taken her with him to Much Wenlock to look at an organ, and while he was inside arguing about the bellows, she had wandered out into the churchyard, where 4 men were standing round a bell that had been lowered out of the tower onto a bed of straw. It was a great green-brown thing, taller than she was, with a lip you could have sat inside, and one of the men was striking it with the ball of a hammer and shaking his head, and the others were arguing about whether the crack ran up from the lip or down from the shoulder. She had listened for perhaps a minute. Then she had said, to nobody in particular, that the crack was nothing to do with it, and that the bell had never been right, and that its hum was a good quarter of a tone under its own note, and always had been, and that whoever had hung it had put a clapper in it, fit for a bell 100 weight heavier, and it had been beating itself to death for 80 years, and had finally got the job done. The men had turned round and looked at her. She had gone scarlet, and expected to be sent off, but one of them, an oldish man in a brown coat with his hat pushed back and white hair stuck to his forehead with the heat, had not laughed. He had crouched down so that his face was level with hers, and he had looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not understood at all. Something like a man finding a sovereign in a gutter and being almost afraid to pick it up. "Say that again," he had said, slowly, and she had. And he had made her stand with her back to the bell while he struck it in different places and asked her what she heard, and she had told him, hum and the strike, and the third, and the fifth, and the octave above, and how the third sat sour, and how the fifth was scarcely there at all, like a voice in a fever. Nobody in the churchyard had said anything for a while. Then the old man had stood up, and put his hand on the crown of the bell as though it were a horse, and said, more or less to himself, that he had spent 50 years learning to hear what this girl had walked out of a gate and heard for nothing. He had asked her name. She had given it. He had written it in a little book with a pencil and thanked her gravely, exactly as though she had been a man of business, and she had gone back to her father and thought no more of it for 8 years. She had never known his name. She had never asked it. Ambrose Ferrand of Quat Bank, Bellfounder, Clemency sat in the cold with the letter in both hands and the whole of her scalp prickling, and her aunt said from the window, in a voice that was not quite steady, "Clem, you have gone very quiet." The coach for Bridgenorth left the Talbot at 7 and cost 4 shillings inside and 2 and 6 on the roof, and Clemency went on the roof with her father's tuning case on her knees and a piece of oilcloth over both, and arrived at 10:30 with her hands frozen to the case and her cheeks scoured pink by the wind off the Wrekin. Bridgenorth on a market Thursday in February is a town of 2 halves, low and high, joined by a cliff and a great many steps. She climbed the steps. The high street at the top was full of pens and pigs and standings and shouting, and she went up it through the smell of wet wool and dung with her heart going hard, and found the brass plate of Mr. Josiah Quillen between a saddler's and a bank. The clerk took her up. The room at the top was low-ceilinged and warm and smelled of coal and sealing wax, and it had 3 people in it already, and every one of them turned and looked at her when the door opened. Mr. Quillen was small and neat, and about 50, with round spectacles and a pen behind his ear. He rose and bowed and said, "Miss Ware, and thank you for coming so far in such weather," with an air of relief that told her he had not been sure she would come at all. The second person was a stout grey-haired woman of about 60, in a brown stuff gown and a white apron and a mob cap, who sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes red, and who looked at Clemency with a frank, exhausted, unfriendly curiosity. The third was a gentleman. He was 35 or thereabouts, sleek and fair, with a narrow face and a thin mouth and a bottle-green tailcoat and a collar starched so high he had to turn his shoulders to look sideways. He did not rise. He looked her over from the mud on her half-boots to the 4-year-old bonnet, and something in his face relaxed, as though he had been braced for a difficulty and had found there was none. Mr. Quillen said, "Miss Ware, this is Mr. Gilbert Ferrand, nephew of the deceased of Worcester, and Mrs. Tapp, who kept house for Mr. Ferrand these 19 years. Clemency said, "How do you do?" and sat where she was put. Mr. Quillen said that they would begin, and that there was a fourth party expected who had not come, and that he would not wait past the quarter. He read. It went on a long while in the way those documents do, and Clemency understood perhaps half of it, and it was the half that mattered. Ambrose Ferrand, of Quat Bank in the parish of Quat in the county of Salop, Bellfounder, being of sound and disposing mind, gave and devised unto Clemency Ware, spinster of Shrewsbury, daughter of the late Thomas Ware, tuner of instruments, all that his messuage and works called Ferrand's Bell Works at Quat Bank, with the moulding house, the casting pit, the drying stove, the tuning shop, the metal store, the wharf and the dwelling house adjoining, together with all his patterns, crooks, strickleboards, moulds, gauges, forks, tools, stock of metal, and every book and paper of the business without exception, to hold to her and her heirs for ever. There was a sound from the chair by the window. Mr. Gilbert Ferrand had sat forward. Mr. Quillen read on without looking up, and I direct, the will said, that my foreman and head moulder Jonas Kerrick shall continue in the works at his present wage for the term of 7 years from my death, and shall not be dismissed within that term save for drunkenness or dishonesty proved before a magistrate. And I further direct that the said works shall not be sold, let, mortgaged or broken up within the said term of 7 years without his consent in writing. Clemency's hands had gone quite cold in her lap. And whereas there is now standing to the account of the said works a contract with the Dean and Chapter of Marchbourne for a ring of 8 bells, the tenor of 25 hundredweight, to be delivered, hung and left in tune by the feast of St. Michael next, under a bond of £2,000, I declare that if the said contract be not performed to the day, or if the said works be at any time within 7 years found idle and no bell in the pit, then the whole devised to the said Clemency Ware shall cease and determine, and the works with all thereto belonging shall go over to my nephew Gilbert Ferrand absolutely. Mr. Quillen turned the page and stopped and cleared his throat and said, and there is one more paragraph, which is not usual, and which he required me to set down in his own words. He read it. To those who will ask why I have done this thing, I say only that on the 17th of July 1815, in the churchyard at Much Wenlock, I heard a girl of 15 tell me in 1 minute what was wrong with the Wenlock tenor, and she was right in every particular, and I had been 50 years coming to the same opinion. I have looked for such an ear all my life, and I have found it once. My trade is not a trade of hands. Any man may learn the hands. It is a trade of ears. And there are perhaps 4 true ears in England, and I am now to be subtracted from the number. I do not leave my works to a woman. I leave them to an ear, and the ear happens to be in a woman, and I am too old and too near the end to care what the county says of it. The room was quite silent. Then Mr. Gilbert Ferrand laughed, once not loudly, and said, well, he got up and went to the window and stood looking down at the pigs in the high street with his hands behind his back. My uncle, he said pleasantly, was 74, and had been in a foundry since he was 9, and had been deaf as a post in his left ear these 10 years. I am sure Miss Ware will understand that this instrument will not stand. Mr. Quillen said, coldly, that Mr. Ferrand was of course at liberty to enter a caveat, and that he would find the will proved in due course, and that in the meanwhile the works stood devised as read. Gilbert Farron turned round and smiled at Clemency with great civility. "Miss Ware," he said, "you have no notion what you have been given, and I say that without the least unkindness. My uncle has left you a hole in the ground with a fire in it, a debt at every merchant between here and Bristol, 8 bells not begun, and 7 months to make them in, and a bond of £2,000 that will follow you to the end of your life. And he has tied a man to you for 7 years, who has expected that works since he was 16, and who will not thank you for it." He drew on his gloves. "Take £300 from me," he said, "and go home to Shrewsbury and buy your aunt a house. I will have the works and the bond and the whole misery of it, and you will be a good deal richer than you are this morning. Think of it as a kindness." Clemency looked at her hands. £300, she thought with perfect clarity that £300 was 7 years of tuning pianofortes, that it was coal and a fire in February, and a doctor for her aunt's eyes, and never again asking Mrs. Halloway for 4 shillings in a cold hall. Then she thought of an old man crouching down in a churchyard to be level with a girl's face, and writing her name in a little book with a pencil, and keeping it for 8 years. She said without looking up that she would go and see it first. The nephew's smile did not change, but something behind it did. "By all means," he said, "it is 9 miles. Mrs. Tapp will give you your dinner. I shall call on you in a fortnight, and I think you will be readier to talk to me then." He bowed and went out, and they heard him go down the stairs, whistling. Mr. Quillen took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose and looked at Clemency for a while. "Miss Ware," he said at last, "I drew that will in October, and I told him plainly it would be fought, and he said he knew it. He also said that if you came to look at the works, and if you stayed above 1 hour, the thing would be all right. He would not tell me what he meant by that." He put his spectacles back on. "The carrier goes down at 2, he said. I would advise you to be on it." The carrier's cart went down out of the town by the low road and along the Severn, and the rain stopped somewhere past Erdington, and the sky came out a washed pale blue with the wet fields steaming under it. Mrs. Tapp sat on the sacks opposite Clemency with her basket on her knees and did not speak for 4 miles. Then she said, abruptly, that she supposed Miss Ware would be selling. Clemency said she had not decided anything. Mrs. Tapp made a sound in her nose and looked out at the river. She said, after another mile, that she had put a shoulder of mutton down, and there would be dinner at 4 whatever Miss Ware decided, and that she had best be told now that Jonas Carrick had not come to the reading because he had said he would not sit in a room and be given away like a dog in a sack. Clemency said nothing to that either. There did not seem to be anything to say. Quatbank is not a village. It is a bend of the Severn under a wooded scarp, with a wharf, a lane, 6 cottages, a lime kiln that had gone out in the war, and a long, low huddle of buildings, with a slate roof and a very tall chimney standing back from the water on a made-up platform of slag and clay. They came down the lane at 4 o'clock, with the sun getting low and red behind the trees on the far bank, and Clemency saw it for the first time, and the first thing she noticed was the smell, hot sand and charcoal, and horse dung, and under it something metallic and sweetish and old, like the inside of a coin. The second thing she noticed was that it was silent. There were 9 men in the yard, and not one of them was working. They were standing about in 2s and 3s near the door of the moulding house with their arms folded, and when the cart came in at the gate, every head turned. Mrs. Tapp got down and said, "That's her," in a flat voice, and went into the house. Clemency got down with her tuning case in her hand because she had nothing else to hold, and stood in the middle of a yard full of men who had been told 9 days ago that their living had been left to a piano tuner from Shrewsbury. Nobody said anything. Then the door of the moulding house darkened, and a man came out of it, and the men made way for him without seeming to move much, and she knew before he had come 6 steps who he was. He was tall, 6 foot or over it, and built through the shoulders like a man who has lifted for a living since he was a boy. Black hair cropped close, 3 days of dark stubble, slate-grey eyes set deep under a heavy brow. His forearms were bare to the elbow and marked with soot and old white burn scars, and he wore a coarse cream linen shirt and a scuffed brown leather apron and dark trousers. And he came across that yard and stopped 6 feet away from her and looked down at her without one flicker of anything in his face. "Miss Ware," he said. "Mr. Carrick," she said. He looked at the tuning case, then at the bonnet, then back at her face. "You've come to see what you've got," he said. "I'll show you, and then I'll say what I have to say, and then you can go back and tell Quillen." He turned and walked off, and she went after him, and the men parted and closed again behind her, and she felt every one of their eyes on her back. He showed her the works the way a man shows a creditor round a house he is about to lose. This is the metal store. Coppers the pigs on the left, tins the blocks, and there's neither enough of one nor a quarter of the other. This is the moulding house. That pit in the floor is 14 foot deep, and it was dug by his grandfather. Those are the crooks, the strickle boards, 1 pair for every bell we've ever cast, and if you lose one you can't make its like again, and there are 240 of them on that wall, and every one is a bell that isn't in the world yet. This is the loam mill. Loam's clay and horse dung and hair and sand and water, and it's mixed wet and laid on in coats and dried between every coat, and it takes a fortnight to build a core and a fortnight to build a cope, and a week to dry them and a night to cast and 8 weeks to tune, and there are 8 bells to do by Michaelmas, and it is now the 20th of February. He said all of it in the same flat voice, walking, not looking to see whether she followed. This is the stove. That's the furnace. That flue's cracked at the elbow and has been since November, and it wants relining, and the fire clay is £3.10 a ton, and we haven't got £3.10. They came out at the end into the tuning shop, and here he stopped. It was a long room with a north light, whitewashed and cleaner than the rest, and along one wall stood a great vertical machine of iron and oak, like a lathe stood on end, with a chuck plate the size of a cartwheel, and a slide rest, and a hand crank. Against the other wall were shelves, and on the shelves, in racks, lay tuning forks, dozens of them, scores of them, in every size from a thing like a hairpin to a fork, as long as her forearm, and each with a little brass tag wired to its stem. And in the middle of the floor, on a bed of straw, sat a bell. It was about 700 weight, she thought, though she had no way of knowing. It came to her chest. It was the pale grey gold of new bell metal where it had been shaved, and the dull brown of a walnut where it had not, and it was the most beautiful object she had ever been in a room with. "That's the fourth bell of the Marchborn 8, Carrick said. "It's the only one of the 8 that's cast. He cast it in October and he tuned it in November, and it was the last thing he did. It's 100 weight of good metal, and it is no use to anybody. Because a ring of 8 is a ring of 8, and 1 bell out of 8 is a lump." He put his hand on the shoulder of it. "Now," he said, "here's what I have to say." He turned round. "I came here at 11-year-old, he said. "I carried loam. I have been 15 year in this yard. There is no man living outside of Whitechapel and Gloucester who can build a cope better than I can build it, and I built that one, and I built the 2 that failed before it and found out why they failed, and I have run this works entire since his chest went bad 2 winters ago. He told me he stood where you're standing, and he told me that this yard would go where the work went." His voice had not risen at all, which somehow made it worse. "And he has left it to a woman he met once for 10 minutes in a churchyard when she was a child." Clemency said, "I did not know his name until Tuesday." "I know that," Carrick said. "Quillen told me. It makes no odds. I don't blame you for it. You may as well know that, so we needn't dance about." "You didn't do it. He did it. And he was 3 parts mad by the end. And he has ruined this works to make a point about ears." He folded his arms. "So here it is plain. You can't sell without me, and I won't consent. You can't dismiss me, and you can't afford to keep me, and there's no money to pay the men Saturday week. Farron's nephew will take it by Michaelmas, whatever either of us does, because those 8 bells cannot be made in 7 months by 7 men with no metal and no credit, and I have done the sum 40 times since he died, and it does not come out. So go home, Miss Ware. Take his £300. He'll offer you 300, he told the carrier as much, and go home and let it end decent." The light was going out of the north window behind him. Somewhere in the yard a man laughed at something and stopped. Clemency stood in the middle of the floor of the tuning shop with her father's case in her hand and looked at him, and she was aware of being frightened in a way she had not been frightened since the day of her father's funeral, and underneath the fright, quite separate from it, like a second person, standing behind her shoulder, she was aware of being angry. She said, "May I ask you one thing?" He waited. She said, "When he tuned this bell in November, was he satisfied with it?" Carrick's brows came down. "What?" "Was he satisfied with it?" she said. "Did he say it was right?" "He said it was the best 4th he ever cut," Carrick said. "He had it struck 50 times. Why?" Clemency set her case down on the bench. "Then he was going deaf faster than he knew," she said, "because it is not right." The silence that came after that was of a different quality altogether. Carrick said, very quietly, that she had been in the room 90 seconds. "I know," she said. She walked round the bell. She put out one hand and laid the flat of her palm against the waist of it, and then took it away, and knelt down on the straw with her ear about a foot from the lip. "Strike it," she said. He did not move. "Mr. Carrick," she said, "you have told me I am a fool and a thief's legatee, and I have not argued with you. Strike the bell." There was a wooden mallet on the bench. He took it and struck the sound bow of the bell a short, clean blow, and the note went up and filled the room and hung there, and turned slowly in the air the way they do, and Clemency shut her eyes. She listened all the way down. It takes about 11 seconds for a bell of that weight to go from strike to silence, and in those 11 seconds she went through it like a woman going through a drawer. Then she stood up and brushed the straw off her skirt. "The strike note is D," she said. "It is a little sharp of D, perhaps an eighth of a comma, and that is nothing, and you may leave it. The nominal is true, the quint is a shade wide, and it does not signify. The hum is an octave under, and it is dead true, and whoever cut that hum knew what he was about." She paused. "The tierce is flat," she said. "Not a great deal. About a fifth of a semitone. And it is flat in a particular way. It does not sit under the prime, it wanders under it, so that when the bell has been sounding 4 seconds, the third begins to beat against the prime, slowly, about twice in a second. You would not hear it in a tower with 7 other bells going. You would hear it in a room, and you would hear it in a still churchyard at a funeral when one bell tolls alone, which is what a tenor and a fourth are chiefly used for at Marchbourne, because they toll the fourth for a woman and the tenor for a man in that county. She turned round and looked at him. He was standing exactly where he had been standing, and his arms had come unfolded. He had a hand of 92, she said. Your master. 92 on this bell, and I would put my father's forks against it. And in 3 years' time, when the whole ring is up, and the Dean's chapter are tolling for some old canon on a quiet Tuesday, somebody in that church who has never heard of any of us is going to say to his wife, there is something sad about that bell, and he will not know why, and it will be that. It will be a third that will not sit still. The mallet was still in Carrick's hand. Behind him in the doorway, though neither of them had heard him come, a stooped white-haired man in his 70s, with bushy side whiskers and a leather skull cap, was standing with his mouth slightly open, holding a lantern. The old man said, in the too loud voice of the very deaf, Jonas, Jonas, what did she say about the tierce? His name was Ephraim Boyce, and he had been the tuner at Quat Bank for 51 years, which is to say he had stood at that vertical machine and cut the inside of every bell the works had made since the year of Trafalgar, under the master's ear and the master's hand on his shoulder, 1 tap for take more, 2 for stop. He was 73 and he was stone deaf above middle C, and had been for 6 years, and every man in the yard knew it, and none of them had ever said it out loud. And he had gone on cutting, because the master could still hear enough for 2, and because there was nobody else. He came into the room with the lantern held up, and set it on the bench, and took Clemency by the elbow with no ceremony whatever, and said again, say it again, close, she said it again, into his good ear, loudly and slowly. The tierce is flat by about 1/5 of a semitone, and it wanders. Ephraim Boyce stood quite still. Then he said, "Oh," and put his hand over his eyes. Carrick said, "Sharply, Ephraim, I told him," the old man said. "Jonas, I told him in November. I said to him, Master, I'm not easy on the third. I can't hear it, but I'm not easy. My hands weren't easy on the crank." And he stood there and he said, "Ephraim, you've cut 140 bells for me, and you've never cut a bad one." And he laid his hand on my shoulder, and he give me 1 tap, and I took another 24 thou off it, and I have not slept right since Christmas. He took his hand down. His eyes were wet and furious. He couldn't hear it, he said, and I couldn't hear it. And there were 2 of us in this shop, and between us we had 1 ear, and it was nobody's. He turned round to Clemency, and looked at her the way a drowning man looks at a rope. "Are you sure?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then thank God," said Ephraim Boyce, and sat down on the straw beside the bell like a man whose legs had gone. Nobody spoke for a while. The lantern hissed. Carrick set the mallet down on the bench with great care, as though it had become something that might go off. He said, "Can it be mended?" Clemency looked at the bell. She had never in her life tuned a bell. She had tuned 400 pianofortes, and 2 organs and a harp and, once, on a wager, a set of handbells belonging to a curate at Atcham. She knew, because her father had known, and had talked about it in the workshop on winter evenings, the way other men talk about horses, that a bell is tuned by taking metal off the inside, and that taking metal off the inside at different heights alters different partials, and that you may lower a note but you can never raise it, and that a bell is therefore cast a little sharp everywhere and cut down to the truth, and that when you have cut too far there is nothing to be done in this world but melt it and start again. She said, "The tierce is flat. You cannot raise a flat note," Ephraim said. "From the floor, no, you cannot." "But," said Clemency. She knelt down again and ran her hand round the inside of the lip, and the metal was cold and slightly greasy and unbelievably smooth. "But it is not the third that is wrong," she said slowly. "Not really. Everything else on this bell sits on the prime, and the prime is where he left it, and the third is flat against the prime by 1/5 of a semitone. If you cannot raise the third, then you must lower everything else onto it." There was a silence of a completely different sort. Ephraim Boyce said, "Oh, you would not dare. You would take the prime down 1/5 of a semitone," said Clemency, "and the nominal with it, and the quint after it, and the hum last, and you would come out with a bell in C sharp instead of a bell in D. And it would be a true bell, and it would want the other 7 cast a semitone under the drawing to match it." She stood up. "Which you have not cast yet," she said. "So it costs you nothing but a line in a letter to the Dean." Carrick had not moved. He said, in a strange voice, "How much metal is in that?" Clemency said, "I have no idea. That is your trade, not mine. I can tell you where the notes must go. I cannot tell you how to get them there." And then she added, because she was 23 and tired, and had been called a fool in her own building, and because some devil got into her, I understood that any man could learn the hands. Ephraim Boyce made a noise on the floor that, in a younger man, would have been a laugh. Jonas Carrick looked at her for a long, long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Tapp puts dinner at 4, and it is gone 5, and turned and walked out of the tuning shop, and she could not for the life of her tell whether she had won anything at all. She did not go home on the carrier at 2 the next day, or the day after that. She wrote to her aunt instead, and to Mr. Boucher, and to the churchwardens of St. Julian's to say she could not play the organ on Fridays for some months, and to recommend a young man named Cottam who wanted the work, and she took the small bedroom at the end of the passage in the dwelling house, which had a window looking out over the yard and the wharf and the river, and which Mrs. Tapp made up for her in a stony silence that lasted 9 days and then, for reasons Clemency never entirely established, stopped dead one morning over the question of whether Miss Ware took sugar. She had £11 4 in the world. She wrote that at the top of a clean page. Underneath it she began to write what she found in the counting-house, and by the end of the first week the page had turned into 4 pages, and she had stopped being frightened in a general way, and had started being frightened about particular things, which is at least a form of progress. Farron's Bell Works owed £190 to Rawnsley and Son of Bristol for copper, of which 40 was 2 years old. It owed £31 to a coal factor at Highley. It owed £14 odd to the Fireclay people, and 9 to the horse doctor, and £106 to the Bridgenorth Bank on a note that fell due in June, and 7 weeks' wages to 7 men and a boy, which came to £52 and some shillings, and which was the only one of those figures that made her feel sick. Against that it had 1 bell, cast, tuned, and wrong, a wharf, 240 pairs of strickle boards, a horse, 4 tons of pig copper, 19 hundredweight of tin, when it needed nearer 9 tons of metal in all for 8 bells, and a contract with the Dean and Chapter of Marchbourne, under which the chapter would pay £1,140, 400 on the first 4 bells delivered, the rest at Michaelmas, and nothing, not 1 shilling, in advance. And it had a bond of £2,000. She sat in the counting house on the 3rd afternoon, with the ledger open and her hands flat on the desk, and looked at the wall. The counting house was a small square room off the yard, with a coal stove and a sloping desk, and a window with a view of the pit shed, and it smelled of Ambrose Ferrand, of pipe tobacco and ink, and the peculiar mustiness of a room where a man has sat for 50 years. His hat was still on the peg. His stick was still in the corner. Mrs. Tapp had not touched either, and Clemency did not touch them, and for the whole of that spring they stayed there, and she got so used to them she stopped seeing them, and then one day in July she saw them again and had to go outside. On the 4th day she found the ledger that mattered. It was on the top shelf behind the fire buckets, and it was not the business books. Those were in the desk, in a clerk's hand. This was a quarto volume bound in quarter calf with a rubbed spine, and there were 5 more like it behind it, and they went back to 1771. She got them down and opened the last one. Every page was the same. At the top, a date and a place and a weight. Under that, a 5-line stave drawn by hand with a rule, and on the stave 5 notes, and beside each note a figure in a spidery hand, plus or minus so many hundredths. Bell for Cleobury Mortimer, 8 CWT 2 car, cast 4th May 1817. Hum -3, prime 0, tierce -2, quint +6, nominal 0. Note quint wide, cannot get it in without robbing the waist. Let it go, they will never hear it in that tower. Bell for Astley Abbots, recast, 5 CWT, cast 19th September 1817. Hum -14. Note, hum will not come. Metal is old and full of lead, from a chapel bell of 1620 by God knows who. Cut 4 times and dare not cut again. Delivered and said nothing. Bell for Chelmarsh, tenor, cast 2nd June 1818. Note, E, all true. Note, this is the best bell I have made, and I do not know why it came right and the last did not. Clemency sat down on the floor of the counting house with the book on her knees, in her cloak, with the stove out, and read for 4 hours. It was not a business record. It was a confession, and a memorandum, and a 50-year argument with himself about why bells go wrong. And it was, though it took her 3 evenings to understand this, a chart of a man losing his hearing. Because the figures changed. Up to about 1808 they were fine-grained and detailed, +2, -3, a fifth of a comma here, a shade there. After 1812 the top of the stave got vaguer. After 1816 he wrote nothing at all against the nominal on 2 bells in 3, And in 1819 there was a page that had nothing on it but a date and a weight and one line, "I cannot hear the fifth partial any longer." I have known this since March and have written it nowhere. In 1820, Ephraim's crank hand is better than my ear now, and neither of us will say so. In 1821, in a shakier hand, I am robbing them. Every bell I send out of this yard now is a bell somebody's grandchildren will live with for 300 years, and I am guessing at it. Whitechapel would not take a guess. Rudge at Gloucester would take a guess and be glad. I will not have my name on guesses. And then in June 1822, in the middle of a page, with no heading at all, I have written to Quillen about the Shrewsbury girl. She will be 23 now if she lives. The Wenlock tenor is broken up these 6 years, and I am the only man alive who knows what she said about it, and I have carried it about with me like a stone in a shoe for 7 years, because she was right, and because she was 15, and because she was a girl, and because I did nothing. Clemency put her hand over her mouth. Under it he had written, "I am 73. Jonas can do everything I can do with his hands, and he will do it better. And Jonas is worth 10 of me, and I would leave him the works tomorrow and sleep easy. Except that Jonas cannot hear a tierce and never will, and he thinks that ears are a thing men say to make a mystery of a trade. If I leave it to him, he will make good bells for 40 years, and a few of them will be sour, and he will never know which. If I leave it to her, she cannot mould, cannot found, cannot cast, cannot manage, cannot lift, and cannot be received in any house in the county. But she can hear. And I have been 50 years learning that the whole trade, the whole of it, from the loam up, is nothing but a means of getting a note into the air. And then the last line, and it was underscored twice, "If they have any sense, they will do it together. If they have not, God help the pair of them, but I shall be dead and past minding." Clemency shut the book. She sat on the floor for a while longer. Then she got up and put the volume under her arm and went out across the wet yard in the dark to the moulding house, where a light was still burning at 9 at night, and where Jonas Kerrick was sitting alone on an upturned box with a lantern beside him and a broken strickle-board across his knees, mending it with a rasp because nobody had told him to, and because he could not sleep either. He looked up. She said, "I have found something you had better read." He said nothing for a moment, and then he said in a voice with no expression in it at all that she had better read it to him. And she understood, standing there in the doorway with the rain starting again behind her, that Jonas Kerrick could not read. He said it without shame and without apology, which she came to understand later was simply how he said everything, but she did not know that yet, and she stood in the doorway with the book under her arm and felt the ground shift. He said, "I know my figures. I can read a weight and a gauge and my own name. I can sign for a load. Ephraim reads me the letters, and Quillen's clerk reads me the contracts, and the master read me everything else for 15 years, and there is nobody left in this yard who reads but the boy, and I am not going to be read to by a boy of 17. He put the rasp down. "So if there's something in that book about me," he said, "you may as well say it standing where you are, and I'll take it as it comes." Clemency came in and shut the door against the rain. There was another box by the bench. She sat down on it and set the lantern between them and opened the ledger on her knees, and she found the page and she read it to him. All of it. The bit about Whitechapel and the guesses. The bit about the fifth partial in 1819. The bit about the Shrewsbury girl and the stone in the shoe. And then, because there was no way of reading the page without it, the bit about him. Jonas can do everything I can do with his hands, and he will do it better. And Jonas is worth 10 of me, and I would leave him the works tomorrow and sleep easy, except that Jonas cannot hear a tierce, and never will. She stopped there. He said, "Go on." She read the rest. She read the last line twice, because he asked her to. Then she closed the book, and there was a long silence in the moulding house, and the rain went on the slates, and the loam in the trough gave off its faint animal smell, and the 240 pairs of strickleboards hung on the wall in the dark like the ribs of something. Jonas Carrick sat with his forearms on his knees and his big scarred hands hanging. He said at last he never told me. "No," said Clemency, 15 year. He never once told me he was going deaf. He let me think. He let me stand there in the tuning shop and think that I was slow. He'd say, "Jonas, come and listen to this." And I'd listen and I'd hear a bell. And he'd say, "No, listen to the third." And I'd say, "I can't get at it, master." And he'd say, "You will. You're young." And I never did. He rubbed his face with both hands, and all that while he could not get at it neither. He was ashamed, said Clemency. "I'd have carried him," said Carrick. 15 year I'd have carried him. He had only to say it. Then he laughed, one short, unamused breath, and said, "And instead he goes and buys an ear off a churchyard wall and leaves it my works and dies." Clemency said, "He did not leave me your works." Carrick looked up. "He left me a rope," she said, "and he tied the other end to you, and he threw us both in the river to see whether we'd swim. If he had wanted to be kind to either of us, he would have left you the works, and me £100 a year to come and listen 4 times a year, and go home again. He did not want to be kind. He wanted the bells right." She stood up and put the ledger down on the bench between them. "Mr. Carrick, I have seen the books. I know what is owed, and I know what is coming in and when. 7 months, 8 bells, no metal, no credit, no money for Saturday's wages, a bond of £2,000, and a nephew who has only to sit in Worcester and wait. You told me on the first evening that you had done the sum 40 times, and it does not come out." "I have," he said. "It does not." "Then I will tell you the only thing I know," said Clemency, "that you do not. It does not come out for a works that is making 8 ordinary bells for £1,140. There is no version of that sum that comes out. So we must not make 8 ordinary bells." He said, "What does that mean?" "It means," she said, "that if I have understood what is in that book, and in those 6 books, and in 51 years of Ephraim Boyce's hands, then this yard can put up a ring at Marchbourne, with a true tierce in every bell of the 8. And there is not another founder in England who can promise that, and know it before the bells are hung. Not Whitechapel, not Rudge. They tune by rule, and by the master's ear, and they hope we would know." Carrick said slowly that a chapter does not pay extra for a thing they cannot hear the want of. "No," said Clemency, "but a chapter will pay on delivery for a thing they can hear the presence of. And a dean who has been given a ring that answers itself will talk about it to every other dean in the province for 20 years. And there are 400 towers in this country with cracked rings in them and a subscription list half filled." She sat down again. I am not asking you to like it, she said. I am asking whether you will build me 8 copes and 8 cores and stand at that pit and cast them, and let me say where the notes go. And let Ephraim's hands and my ear do between them what one whole man used to do. And if it fails at Michaelmas, I will go back to Shrewsbury and tune pianofortes till I die, and you may have the satisfaction of having said so in February. The lantern flame stood up straight. Jonas Carrick looked at her for a while, and she made herself hold his eyes, which was not easy, and which she thought afterwards was probably the single most important half-minute of her whole life. He said, "You cannot mold." "No," she said, "you cannot lift, you cannot found, you do not know a strickle from a shovel, and if you come into that pit shed on a casting night, in that gown you will go up like a torch." "I know," she said, "and you have no money." £11, said Clemency. 4 shillings. He got up. He was very tall in that low building, and the lantern threw his shadow the whole length of the wall. He said, "The wages are £52, and they are due Saturday week. And if the men are not paid, they will go to Rudge at Gloucester, and Rudge will take them and be glad. And then there is no yard here at all, whatever either of us says." "Then we must find £52 by Saturday week," said Clemency. And he said, and she heard, for the first time, something underneath the flatness, something that was not agreement, and was not surrender, but was, unmistakably, the sound of a man beginning to think about a problem, instead of about the end of the world. £52 and 11 for the horse doctor, or he'll not come out to us again, and that mare's foot wants him. She did not smile until she was outside in the rain. They found £63, and it took 9 days, and it cost her a good deal. 12 came from the wharf. There was a fortnight's worth of Hyley coal sitting on Farron's ground under a tarpaulin that belonged to a factor who had gone bankrupt in November, and Carrick had been leaving it alone out of a sort of obstinate honesty, and Clemency wrote to the assignees and bought it for 8 and sold half of it in Bridgenorth for 20 and kept the rest for the furnace, which Carrick said, with the nearest thing to approval she had yet had from him, was the first honest bit of thieving he had seen done in that yard. 9 came from the old lime kiln, which had 140 tons of good limestone rubble round it that a road contractor at Alveley wanted and had been too idle to ask for. 14 came from the sale of the second horse, which was 15 and blind in one eye and 8 as much as the good one. And 28 came from her father's pianoforte. It was a square Broadwood of 1804 with a rosewood case and a cracked bridge, and it had stood in the workshop in Shrewsbury for as long as she could remember. And it was the instrument she had learned on, and it was the only object in the world that was still shaped like her father. She had refused to sell it through 2 years of debt. She had gone without a fire in January of 1822 rather than sell it. Mr. Boucher had offered twice to find her a buyer, in that gentle way people have when they mean to be kind and are asking you to cut off a finger. She wrote to her aunt on a Tuesday evening in the counting-house with the stove lit, and Ambrose Farron's hat still on its peg above her, and told her to let Mr. Boucher sell it, and to keep £4 of the money for coal and the doctor, and to send the rest to Bridgenorth by the carrier, and to please not to argue. Her aunt's answer came back written by the stationer's boy, because her aunt could not see to write, and it said, "My dear, he would have sold it himself in a week for a decent set of bellows. Do not be sentimental about wood. Be sentimental about people. Aunt P. Clemency put that letter in the front of Ambrose Farron's ledger, and it stayed there for the rest of her life. The men were paid on the Saturday in the counting house, one at a time out of a tin box, by a woman of 23 in a dove-blue gown, who had known none of their names a month before, and now knew all of them, and their wives' names, and which of them had a girl in Highley, and which of them had a mother in the workhouse at Bridgenorth. There were 7 men and a boy. Ephraim Boyce, tuner, 51 years in the yard. Old Dickon Nash, furnaceman, who spoke perhaps 40 words a week, and could tell the temper of molten bell metal by the colour of the skin on it within 10 degrees. His brother Ben, who did the loam mill. 2 moulders, Tarrant and Whitcomb, who were cousins and who bickered like an old married pair from 6 in the morning. A carter, Tom Sheldrake, who also did the wharf. A general man called Piggott, who was strong and slow, and who could lift the end of a cope alone. And the boy, Kit Halland, 17. Thin, quick, with a head of red hair and a permanently guilty expression, who had been apprenticed by his mother out of Kidderminster, and who was the only man on the place besides Clemency who could read. Every one of them took his money and said, "Thank you, ma'am," and looked at the door. And every one of them came back on Monday. Gilbert Ferrand came on the Tuesday after that, in a hired with a lawyer's clerk beside him, and an air of a man arriving to collect a parcel. He had entered his caveat at Lichfield. He explained it very kindly, standing in the yard, in the tone of a man explaining a railway timetable. The will would be contested on the ground that his uncle, at the date of it, had not the capacity to make one, that he had been failing for years, that he had been notoriously deaf and increasingly strange, that he had left a valuable manufactory to a young woman of no family and no connection whom he had met, on the face of the instrument itself precisely once, in a churchyard, when she was a child. "I do not say," said Gilbert Ferrand, looking at the wharf and the chimney and not at her, "that anything improper has occurred. I say only what will be said, which is not at all the same thing, and which will be said in open court at Lichfield with a shorthand writer present, and the Shrewsbury papers reporting it. You are 23. Consider what that will be like." He turned round and smiled at her. 300, he said. "It is still 300. It will be 200 in June, and it will be nothing at all on the 30th of September. And I shall have the works for the price of a stamp." Clemency said, "Thank you, Mr. Ferrand." "No," he nodded, as though she had confirmed something for him, and got back into the gig. Then he leaned out and said, "Pleasantly, my uncle owed Rawnsley of Bristol £190 for copper. I mention it merely because I dined with young Miss Rawnsley on Thursday and found him a very agreeable man. And he drove away up the lane. Carrick came and stood beside her. They watched the gig out of sight. He said, what did he mean by that? He means to buy the debt, said Clemency, and call it in. Can he do that? Yes, Carrick said something under his breath that she pretended not to hear, and then said, How long? 30 days from when he does it, said Clemency. And we cannot make 8 bells in 30 days, and we cannot make one without copper, and Rawnsley is the only house within reach that will let us have 9 ton of copper on any terms at all. She stood in the middle of the yard in the March wind and looked at the chimney. Then we shall have to get our metal somewhere else, she said. It was Kit Halland who found it, which was the beginning of a good deal. Clemency had set the boy to copy out the Marchbourne contract fare in a large hand, so that it could be read aloud in the counting house and everybody would know what was in it, and on the second evening he came and stood in the doorway, shifting from one foot to the other, until she looked up. "Please, ma'am," he said. "There's a bit here I don't rightly understand, and I don't like to copy what I don't understand in case I get it wrong." It was the 11th clause. It said that the existing ring of 5 bells in the tower of the Church of St. Michael at Marchbourne should be taken down at the founder's charge and conveyed to the founder's works, and there broken up and used in the new ring, and that the weight thereof should be allowed to the dean and chapter against the contract price, at the rate of 1 shilling and 1 penny the pound. Clemency read it 4 times. Then she got up so fast, she knocked the stool over and went out across the yard with the paper in her hand. They worked it out on the bench in the moulding house with a stub of chalk, the 3 of them, Carrick doing the weights in his head faster than she could do them on the board, Ephraim shouting figures nobody had asked for, Kit writing it down. The old ring of 5 at Marchbourne, tenor about 17 hundredweight, and the rest by proportion. Call the 5 of them together 42 hundredweight. 42 hundredweight is 4,700 pounds of bell metal. Bell metal already alloyed, already 13 parts copper to 4 of tin, already made, already bought, already sitting in a tower 19 miles away. Against 9 tons wanted for the new 8, said Carrick. 2 and a bit tons out of the 9, said Clemency, and it wants no copper merchant, and it wants no credit, and Mr. Rawnsley of Bristol cannot touch a pound of it, because it is not ours to buy. It is theirs, and it is coming to us anyway. And it knocks £250 off what we owe on the contract, said Kit, who had been doing the shillings. Carrick said nothing for a moment. Then he said, he knew. Who? The master. He put that clause in. He always put that clause in. He'd argue a chapter into it if he had to. He'd take a shilling, a pound, and lose on it sooner than let old Metal go out of the county. But he wrote this contract in September, and he was ill in September, and he knew what he was leaving, and to who. He looked at the chalked figures on the bench. He left you the metal, he said. He couldn't leave you money. So he left it you as 5 bells in a tower. There was only one difficulty, and it was not a small one. The contract said the old ring should come down at the founder's charge. It did not say when. It said the new 8 should be hung by Michaelmas, and everybody who had signed it had assumed, in the ordinary way of such things, that the old bells would come down in August when the new ones were ready to go up, so that the parish should not be without a bell all summer. Clemency needed them in April. A parish without bells is not a small thing in 1823. There is no other clock that everybody can hear. There is nothing else that says a child has been christened, or that a woman is dead, or that it is 6 in the morning and time to be up, or that the French are not coming after all. Marchbourne had had a bell in that tower since before the Reformation, and had not been without one for longer than a week in 300 years, and Clemency Ware proposed to take all 5 of them down in the 2nd week of April, and give them back on the 29th of September. Mr. Quillen said it could not be asked. She asked it anyway. They rode to Marchbourne on the 8th of April, and they rode because the coach did not go that way and the gig had a cracked shaft, and so there was nothing for it but the good horse and the carrier's cob, and Clemency, who had been put on a farm pony at 9 and had not been on anything since. Spent 19 miles discovering muscles she had not previously been introduced to. Carrick did not laugh at her. He shortened her stirrup at Kelmarsh without being asked, and at Cleobury he said, "Sit back on the downslopes and let him do it. You're fighting him." And about 4 miles further on he said, out of a clear sky and after an hour of silence, that his mother had been a lock-keeper's daughter at Stourport and had put him on a barge horse at 4 years old. It was the first thing he had ever told her about himself. She said, "Is she living?" "No," he said, "nor my father." There was a fever at Stourport in '98, and it had the pair of them in a fortnight, and me and my sister went to my uncle at Quat, who was a nail-maker and no good at it, and I went in the yard at 11 because there wasn't the bread. And your sister? Married a bargeman. 6 children. Lives at Bewdley. She thinks I'm a fool for stopping. Why did you stop? He rode 100 yards before he answered. Because of the noise it makes, he said. She turned her head. He was looking straight down the road between his horse's ears, and his face was as unreadable as ever, and he said, "You take 140 ton of sand and clay and horse dung, and you build a thing out of it that's nothing but a hole in the shape of a bell. And you dry it a week, and you put 5 ton of fire under a furnace, and you break the plug, and you fill that hole with metal that's hotter than anything you'll ever see in your life, and you wait 3 days, and you dig it out. And it is a lump of dirty brown metal, and it looks like nothing on God's earth. And then somebody hits it with a hammer, and it makes that noise." He shrugged slightly. "I've been at 400 castings, and I have never got over it," he said. "That's all. There's no better reason than that." Clemency did not say anything for some time, because there was a feeling in her chest that she was not at all prepared to examine at 12 miles an hour on a strange horse. Marchbourne is a little grey town in a valley, with a great church in it, too big for the place, the way you find in wool country. And the tower of St. Michael stands up over the roofs, with a stair turret on the northeast corner, and pigeons on every string course. The chapter met at 2 o'clock in the vestry, and there were 5 of them, and Clemency Ware stood in front of them in her dove-blue gown with her bonnet in her hands and her hair coming down at one side from the ride, and stated her business. It went about as well as Mr. Quillen had said it would. The dean was old and gouty and slept. The 2 junior canons were polite and useless. Canon Dr. Rearsby, who was the practical man of the chapter, and who had negotiated the contract with Ambrose Ferrand in the first place, sat with his hands folded and asked one question after another, and made her wretched, not out of cruelty, but out of 30 years of committee work. Who was responsible under the bond? Whether the bond was good against a woman, whether a married woman could be sued upon it, and if she should marry between April and September, what then? Whether the works had a foreman of experience, at which point he looked past her at Carrick, who was standing by the door with his hat in his hand, and said, "Ah, Carrick, yes, I remember you at Kelmarsh." And Carrick said, "Sir." And that was the whole of his contribution to the proceedings, and it was worth more than everything Clemency had said. And the archdeacon, whose name was Vine, and who was about 60 and thin and dry and had not spoken at all, said at last, "Miss Ware, I have no objection to a woman owning a foundry. Women own a great deal, and some of them own it better than their husbands did. My objection is that you propose to take the bells of a parish of 1,100 souls out of their tower in April and give them back at Michaelmas, and to do it on the strength of an opinion held by you alone, that the bell your late employer cast in October is imperfect in a particular that no member of this chapter, and I include myself, can hear at all. He put his fingertips together. Convince me of the ear, he said, and I will fight the parish for you. I can do nothing with the parish about the metal or the money or the almanac, but I have been 40 years in this diocese, and I can carry a vestry meeting on a Thursday night if I believe the thing myself. So, convince me. Clemency said, May we go up the tower? There were 5 bells in the tower of St. Michael at Marchbourne, and they had been there, respectively, since 1591, 1624, 1710, and 1710. And the 2 of 1710 had been cast by a founder at Gloucester, whose great-grandson was Silas Rudge. They went up the turret stair in single file, the archdeacon first, with a lantern, then Dr. Rearsby, then Clemency, then Carrick, then the parish clerk and 2 churchwardens, and, by the time they got to the ringing chamber, about 9 other people, because news of that sort goes round a small town at a speed no engine has yet matched. The bell chamber was a wooden floor and a great oak frame black with age, and dust, and pigeon droppings, and the 5 bells hanging mouth down in their stocks, with the ropes going away through the holes below. Clemency asked for a chair, and they brought one up, and she put it in the middle of the floor facing the west wall, with the bells behind her, and sat down in it. Then she said, I shall not turn round. Dr. Rearsby, will you be good enough to hold my bonnet in front of my face, if it makes you easier? Mr. Carrick will strike the bells with a mallet on the sound bow, one at a time, in any order the archdeacon may choose, and the archdeacon will not tell me which is which, and will please not tell me whether I am right until I have done with all 5. Somebody laughed. The archdeacon did not. He wrote the order on a scrap of paper and gave it to Carrick. And in the bell chamber of St. Michael's at Marchbourne, on the 8th of April 1823, with 14 people crowded on the stairs, and the pigeons going out in a clatter through the louvers, Jonas Carrick struck the old ring of 5, one at a time, and a young woman sat on a chair with her back to them, and spoke. That is the treble. It is F sharp, and it is 9 or 10 cents under, which is nothing. The hum is a bad way under, more than a quarter tone, and it is a thin sort of hum, and I should say the bell has been skimmed inside at some time by somebody who did not know what he was doing. That is the second. E, the strike note, is very nearly true, but there are 2/3 in this bell, and they are half a semitone apart, and they beat against one another like a wasp in a glass, and if you have been told this bell is harsh, that is why. It is not harsh, it is 2 bells. That is the 4th. No, wait, she sat forward with her hands over her eyes. Strike it again, please. He struck it again. That is the 4th, she said, and it is cracked, not through. There is a crack in the sound bow, perhaps 4 inches long, and it does not go through the metal, and it is at the place where the clapper strikes, and it is why the note stops so short. Count how long the others go on, and count how long that one goes on. A bell that size should sound 30 seconds. That one is dead in 9. There was a silence up there. The parish clerk said, In a small voice we've said for 2 years that fourth wanted something. She named the third, B, true, a good bell, the best of the 5, cast in 1591 by a man who knew his business. And then the tenor. She listened all the way down, and then she sat quite still for so long that Dr. Rearsby said, "Miss Ware?" "That is the tenor," she said. "It is A, and it is the bell you toll for the dead in this town." "Yes," said the Archdeacon. "It has no tierce at all," she said. She turned round in the chair, and she was white. "I do not mean it is flat," she said. "I mean there is scarcely one there. There is a hum, and a prime, and a nominal, and a great gap in the middle, where the third of the chord ought to be, and the ear goes looking for it and does not find it. And that is why," she stopped and started again, "that is why when they toll it, everybody in this valley who hears it feels the way they feel. It is not the tolling, it is not the slowness, it is a bell with a hole in the middle of it, and you have all been standing at gravesides listening to that hole for 113 years. Nobody in the bell chamber said anything at all." The Archdeacon looked down at his scrap of paper for a long moment. Then he folded it in 4 and put it in his pocket. He said in a perfectly steady voice that he would call the vestry for Thursday, and that Miss Ware would be good enough to come and say to 1,100 people what she had just said to him. And then he went down the turret stair, very quickly, and it was not until they were all out in the churchyard that Clemency understood he had gone down like that, because he did not want 14 people to see his face. The vestry meeting was on the Thursday at 7 in the evening, and it was held in the nave because the vestry would not hold 1/10 of the people who came. Clemency had never spoken to more than 9 people at once in her life. She stood on the chancel step in her one good gown, with her hands cold and her heart going like a bird in a box, and she looked out over 400 faces by candlelight farmers and weavers, and the 2 innkeepers, and a great many women with their arms folded, and the 6 ringers of St. Michael's in a body near the front with their caps in their hands and murder in their eyes. The ringers spoke first, through their captain, a big slow man of 50 named Prue, who kept the corn mill. He said it very fairly. He said that a ring of 5 had hung in that tower since his great-grandfather's time. He said that his mother had been buried out of that church to that tenor, and so had every mother in the parish for 300 years. He said the ringers had rung every Sunday, and every Christmas Day, and every 5th of November, and that they had rung for Trafalgar and for Waterloo and for the peace, and that they had rung a peal of 5,040 changes for the old king, and that he could not see what a woman from Shrewsbury, who had heard those bells for one afternoon, had to tell any of them about them. And he said last, "And if you take them down in April, ma'am, and it goes wrong at your works in the summer, if the money fails, or the metal fails, or the courts take the place off you, as we hear they may, then that tower is empty, and it is empty for years, and this parish has nothing. Not for a wedding, not for a burial, nothing. And we should have given it away with our own hands." He sat down, and there was a rumble of agreement that went right round the walls. Clemency stood on the step and let it die away. Then she said, "Mr. Prue is quite right, and I want to begin by saying so plainly, because I would rather be beaten in a fair argument than win a crooked one." That got a stir. She went on, "If I fail, this tower is silent for years. That is true, and I will not pretend otherwise, and I am not going to stand here and tell you it cannot happen, because it can. What I will tell you is what you would be giving away. and what you would be getting, and then you may vote and I shall abide it. She told them about the fourth. She told them there was a crack 4 inches long in the sound bow, and that in a bell it does not stay 4 inches, and that in 8 years or in 20 it would run and the bell would be finished, and that when a bell goes in a ring of 5, you do not lose 1 bell, you lose the ring, because 5 will not go with 4, and then it is a subscription and a public meeting and £1,100 in a bad year. And they might have it in 1840 with their own money instead of in September with the chapters. She told them about the second, and the wasp in the glass, and the 2/3 beating, and Prue the miller's head came up at that, and he said, half to himself, "That's it. That's what I've never liked about her." And then she told them about the tenor. She said, "I heard your tenor on Tuesday, and I have not slept well since. It has no third in it. There is a hole in the middle of that bell, where a note ought to be, and every one of you knows the sound of that hole better than you know your own voice, and you have all thought, all your lives, that a funeral bell must sound like that. It need not, it does not, at Kelmarsh, nor at Ludlow, nor at Worcester. It sounds like that here because a man at Gloucester in 1710 cast it in a hurry and took his money." She stopped, and then she said the thing she had not planned to say. "I lost my father 2 years ago come June," she said. "There was a bell rung for him at St. Julian's in Shrewsbury, and I stood in the porch, and I could not go in, and I have thought about the sound of it every week since. I would have given a great deal for it to have been a true one. That is all the interest I have in your tenor. If you send me those 5 bells, I will send you back 8, and the metal of your old tenor will be in the new one, because I shall put it there, and it will toll for the people it has always tolled for, and the hole will be gone out of it." She came down off the step. They voted at 10 minutes past 9, by a show of hands, in a nave so quiet you could hear the candles. The vote was for it, 3-1, and the 6 ringers of St. Michael's voted against to a man. And then Prue the miller came up the aisle afterwards and stood in front of her, twice her size, turning his cap round in his hands, and said, "We'll get 'em down for you ourselves, ma'am. Sunday week. We'll not have strangers handling them." They rang the old 5 for the last time on the Saturday evening, in the 2nd week of April. Everybody came. They rang from 6 until 7:30. Everything they had, rounds and call changes, and a course of grandsire doubles that went wrong in the middle and was laughed at. And at the end they stood them, and Prue rang the tenor alone, 60 strokes, slowly in the dusk, over a churchyard, packed with people not saying anything. Clemency stood at the back by the lich gate, with her hands folded, and listened to the hole in the middle of the bell for the last time. Carrick was beside her. Halfway through he said, very low, "He's tolling it for the bells." "I know," she said. "Can you do it?" he said. "Not the tuning. I've stopped asking about the tuning. Can you and me stand here in September and hand this back to that man?" Clemency watched the tower. "I don't know," she said. "Right," said Carrick. "Good," and she looked up at him and found him looking down at her, and there was something in his face at last, and it was not contempt, and it was not resignation, and neither of them said anything else at all. The bells came down on the Sunday week and came to Quat Bank on 3 wagons, and the whole yard came out to see them in, And Ephraim Boyce walked round the tenor twice with his hand on it, and said, in his too loud voice, that he'd known this bell since he was a lad, and had always thought it a bad one, and had never dared say so. And then the work began in earnest, and for the next 11 weeks, Clemency Ware's life narrowed to the size of a yard by a river. She had said in February that she could not mold, and that was true in April, and was not true in July, though she never got beyond the kind of competence that can be trusted with the second coat, and not the third. Carrick taught her, because there was nobody else to do it, and because he was short-handed, and because, though this took her until nearly midsummer to understand, he had decided somewhere between the vestry meeting and the wagons that if the thing was going to be lost, it was not going to be lost through anything he had left undone. He taught her the loam first, because everything begins there. Loam is not clay. Loam is clay and sand and horse dung and cow hair and water, mixed in a trough to the consistency of thick cream, and it must be exactly right. And the way you know it is right is that you take a handful and squeeze it and open your hand. It should hold the shape of your fingers and not slump and not crack. That is all the science there is to it. Ben Nash had been making it for 20 years and could not have told you the proportions, and did not need to, because his hands knew. Clemency's hands did not know. She stood at that trough on a cold morning in April, with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her arms in wet clay to the forearm, and got it wrong 11 times running while a man of 30 stood over her with his arms folded, saying, "Too wet, too dry now. You've overcorrected. You always overcorrect." And on the 12th she opened her hand, and the loam sat in her palm with the marks of her fingers in it like a small grey heart. And Carrick said, "That's it." And she was more pleased than she had been about anything in 2 years. He taught her the strickle board, the crook, they called it in that yard. It is a plank of oak with one edge cut to the exact profile of half a bell, and it is fixed to a spindle set in the floor of the pit, and you swing it round and round through the wet loam, and the loam that stands proud of the edge is scraped away. And what is left, after 4 days and 11 coats, and a charcoal fire burning inside it all the while to dry it, is the core, a solid dome of baked clay in precisely the shape of the inside of the bell you mean to have. Then you build the false bell on top of the core in a second loam, using a second crook cut to the outside profile, and you get a thing that looks exactly like a bell made of dried mud, and you grease it, and over the false bell you build the cope, in 8 coats, bound with iron straps, and dry that. And then, and this is the part that made Clemency's stomach turn over the first time she saw it, you lift the cope off, and break the false bell to pieces with a bar, and throw the pieces away and put the cope back down over the core. And between the core and the cope there is now a space, exactly bell-shaped, exactly bell-thick, with nothing in it but air. And you fill the air with fire. She had blisters on both palms by the end of April, and calluses by the end of May, and her nails never entirely recovered. She learned to keep her skirts pinned up out of the way, and to wear a leather apron of Ephraim's cut down, and to tie her hair in a linen cap like Mrs. Tapp's. And after about the middle of May, she stopped noticing that she looked like nothing on earth, and in exchange she taught Carrick to hear. That began by accident on a wet evening at the end of April in the tuning shop over the 4th bell. She had been explaining what she meant to do to it, the whole bell to come down a semitone onto its own flat tierce, and he had listened with the particular stone-faced patience he used when he had understood the words and none of the sense. And finally he said, flatly, I can't hear it. I've been listening to that bell for 3 weeks, and I can hear a bell. He put the mallet down. Say it's there, he said. I'll cut where you say. But don't ask me to hear it, because I've been asked that for 15 years by a better man than you, and it has never once come. Clemency looked at him. Then she said, Give me your hand. He did not move. Mr. Carrick, she said, give me your hand and put it flat against the waist of the bell, there, above the shoulder, where the metal's thinnest. He put his hand where she showed him. She struck the bell herself hard with the mallet, and it rang out, and then she said quickly, Now, don't listen. Feel it. She put her own hand on the bell a foot from his. The hum is the whole bell moving, she said. You will feel that in your wrist, low down, like a cart going by. The nominal is the lip, and it is quick and small, and it is in your fingertips. The tierce lives here. She moved her hand, and without thinking about it at all, took hold of his wrist, and moved his hand 2 inches up the curve of the bell, here, on the waist. It comes in about a second after the strike, and it is slower than the rest. And when it is wrong, you do not hear it go wrong. You feel it swim. Nobody said anything. The bell went on sounding under both their hands, and Clemency became aware, in stages of several things, that the metal was humming against her palm, that her fingers were round his wrist, and that his wrist was warm and rough and about twice the thickness of her own, that neither of them had moved, and that Jonas Carrick had shut his eyes. The note ran out and died away. He opened his eyes and looked at his own hand on the bell. Again, he said. She struck it again, and again after that, and 40 or 50 times over the next hour, while the light went out of the north window, and Mrs. Tapp called them twice for supper and was ignored, and somewhere around the 30th stroke he said, in a voice she had never heard him use, Oh, and about the 50th he said, It swims. It swims about here, like a thumb on a glass. Yes, said Clemency. He stood back from the bell and put both hands over his mouth and looked at it, and his eyes were bright in the lamplight. 15 year, he said. You have not got the ear, said Clemency. You never will. Nobody gets it after 12 years old, my father used to say. But you have got the hands, and there is nothing whatever to stop the hands learning it, and Ephraim's hands have known it for 50 years and have never been told what they knew. Carrick turned round. Then teach him, he said. Teach him tomorrow. Teach the whole yard. And that is how it came about that from the 1st of May, the men of Ferran's Bellworks spent the last half hour of every working day standing round a bell in the tuning shop with their hands on it, in silence, like a chapel meeting. And that when Gilbert Ferran's clerk came down the lane at 6 one evening in the middle of the month to serve a paper, that is what he saw through the doorway. And he went back to Worcester and reported that the works had gone queer. The paper the clerk served was a notice of assignment. Rawnsley and Son of Bristol had sold the debt of £190 4 shillings and twopence to Mr. Gilbert Ferrand of Worcester, wine merchant, and Mr. Gilbert Ferrand required payment in 30 days, being on or before the 15th of June, in default of which he would proceed. Clemency read it, standing in the yard, and then went and sat on the wharf wall for 10 minutes with her feet hanging over the water, which was the nearest thing to hysterics she permitted herself that year. Then she came back and called the men into the moulding house and told them exactly what it said, because she had made a rule in March that they should be told everything, on the theory that a man who knows the worst will stay, and a man who suspects it will go. Then she chalked the clock on the wall, and it stood there till September, and every man in that yard could have recited it in his sleep. 15th of June, £190 to Gilbert Farrand or the sheriff comes. The chapter pays 400 on the delivery of the first 4 bells. Therefore 4 bells, cast, tuned, carted, and hung at Marchbourne by the 12th of June. It was the 15th of May. They had 1 bell, the 4th, cast and wrongly tuned, needing to come down a semitone entire. They had, therefore, 3 bells to make from nothing, the treble, the 2nd and the 3rd, being the 3 smallest of the ring, 400 weight, 5 and 6 and a half, in 28 days, in a works that had never in its history made 3 bells in less than 7 weeks. Carrick looked at the chalk for a long time. Then he said, "We cast the treble and the 2nd together, in 1 pit, in 1 pour. 2 moulds, 1 runner. The master never would. He said you have your care when you double your bells. But the metal's the same metal, and the furnace is charged for 1.5 tons either way, and it saves us a week of drying and a ton of coal." Ephraim Boyce said it was madness. Ben Nash said that if they were doing that, they'd want the loam started tonight and not in the morning. And Tarrant and Whitcomb, who bickered like an old married pair from 6 in the morning, said with one voice that they'd want another pair of hands on the mill if they were building 4 copes in a month. And Kit Halland said he could do the mill. And Carrick said, "The boy's on the crook with me." And Clemency heard herself say, "I can do the mill." Nobody laughed. That was the moment, she thought afterwards, when she stopped being the woman who owned the works and became a man short. She did the loam mill for 19 days. They cast the treble and the 2nd on the 4th of June at 11 o'clock at night, and it was the first casting she had ever seen. And she never afterwards saw one without her chest going tight. You do it at night because you must see the colour of the metal, and you cannot judge colour in daylight. The furnace had been charged at 2 in the afternoon, with pig copper and old bell metal broken small. 100 weight and a half of the Marchbourne treble of 1591 went into that first pour, and Clemency put the first piece in herself, because Prue the miller had asked her to, and Dickon Nash had stood at it for 9 hours with a rake and a shovel and a piece of blue glass, and had not spoken above 6 words. At 10:30 the yard filled up. The men. Mrs. Tapp with a jug. 2 of the cottage women. Pigot's father, who was 80. Everybody stood back against the walls of the pit shed, and the pit was open, and down in it, buried to the crown in rammed sand, stood the 2 moulds with their runner going up like a chimney, and the iron straps round the copes shining with grease. At 11:20 Dickon Nash straightened up from the furnace door and said, "1 word. Now." They broke the plug. Clemency had been told what it would be like, and had not believed it, because there is nothing to compare it to. Molten bell metal at 1100 degrees does not look like fire. It looks like white daylight that has been made heavy. It came out of the furnace tap in a rope as thick as a man's arm and ran down the trough into the pit, and the whole shed went the colour of noon, and every face in it, Ephraim's, Kit's, Mrs. Tapp's, the old man's, all of them, stood out lit from below like a row of saints in a window, and the sound was not a roar but a long, soft hiss, like a wave going back down a shingle beach, and the heat came up off it and hit Clemency in the face from 30 feet. It ran for 40 seconds, and then the runner filled and stood, and the metal in the head of it settled and shivered and threw off little stars, and Dick and Nash said, "That's your two." And the men, who had been dead silent, all began to talk at once. Carrick came round the pit to where she was standing with her hand over her mouth. "Well," he said. Clemency could not speak at all for a moment. Then she said, "How do you ever do anything else?" And Jonas Carrick laughed, properly, out loud, for the first time in the 4 months she had known him, so that half the yard turned round and said, "That's it. That's the whole of it. Now you know." They broke them out 3 days later, and both were sound, and the treble came up out of the sand the colour of a wet chestnut, and rang when they knocked the sand off her, like a shilling on a counter. The third failed on the 11th of June. It failed at the pour. They knew it at the pour, which was the one mercy in it, because a bell that fails in the mould and is not found out till the breaking out costs you 3 days more. The metal went down the runner and ran for 11 seconds and then rose in the head, which it should not do for 20. And there was a sound from the pit that Clemency did not understand, and every other person in that shed did, a sort of flat, wet cough, and steam came up round the edge of the cope in a white gout, and Dick and Nash said, "God Almighty," and Carrick had hold of Clemency's arm and was pulling her back against the wall so hard he lifted her off her feet. Nothing exploded. It very nearly did. Steam under a cope will lift a mould and throw a ton of molten metal across a shed, and there were men in that county with no faces because of it, and Carrick had seen it once at Gloucester as a boy of 19, which was why he moved before anybody else in the building. But it only coughed and settled and went quiet, and the metal stood in the runner and went dull. And it was over. They broke it out in the morning. The third bell of the ring of Marchbourne came out of the pit in a state that made Ephraim Boyce sit down on a barrow and say nothing for 5 minutes. The metal had gone down 2/3 of the mould and stopped. There was a crust and a great blistered mass of grey slag where the sound bow should have been, and the whole lower half was a honeycomb, and it was 6.5 hundredweight of the best metal they had, and it was fit for nothing but breaking up and doing again. And doing it again meant a new cope and a new core, and 11 days. And they had one. Carrick went down into the pit and stayed there 40 minutes with a lantern, and came up with sand in his hair and his face like a closed door. And Clemency, who by June could read that face rather better than she could read most people's, took one look at him and said, "In the counting house, not in the yard." He put it on the desk. It was a handful of pit sand, from the bottom of the pit, from under where the mould had stood. It was wet. Clemency said, "The pit is under a roof." "Yes," said Carrick. "We have had no rain since the 2nd. No. That sand was dried and burned and rammed by Ben Nash on the 8th, said Clemency, "and I stood and watched him do it, and I put my own hand in it on the 9th, and it was dry as flour." "Yes," said Carrick. He put both fists on the desk and leaned on them. "There's a quart of water gone into that pit between the 9th night and the 10th night," he said, "and it did not come out of the sky, and it did not come out of the river, and there is nobody comes into this yard at night." They stood there. Then Clemency said quietly, "Where is Kit?" Kit Halland was found sitting on the coal at the far end of the wharf with his arms round his knees, and he had been sitting there since 6 in the morning. And when he saw the two of them coming along the wharf, he stood up and was sick over the side. He told it all in one long, unbroken rush, without being asked a single question, in the way of a boy who has been waiting 11 hours to be found out, and has stopped hoping he will not be. A man had come to him at the Fox at Alveley on the Sunday, a civil man, with a Gloucester way of speaking, who had bought him 2 pots of ale, and told him he was too good a lad for a yard that was going down, and that there was a place for a smart apprentice at Rudge's at 11 shillings a week and his indentures bought out, and that all he wanted meanwhile was a bit of news now and then about how they went on at Quat Bank. And on the Tuesday the man had come again, and had not talked about places at all, and had put down half a sovereign on the table, and said that all that was wanted was that a certain pit should be a little damp on a certain night, and that nobody would ever know, and that it would only put them back a week, and that a works as far behind as this one would go under in July whatever anybody did, and that a lad might as well have half a sovereign out of it as not. And Kit had said no. He said that twice. He said, "I said no, ma'am. I did say no." And then the man had said, in exactly the same friendly voice, that it would be a great pity if Rudges were to write to the boy's mother at Kidderminster about the 3 shillings that had gone missing out of the till at his last place in 1821, which was a thing Kit Halland had done at 15, and had paid back within the month, and had never told anybody at Quat Bank. He had gone out at 1 in the morning with a can from the horse trough. He said, "I'll go, ma'am. I've got my things done up already. I'll go this morning, and you needn't say nothing to anybody. Only please don't write to my mother." He was 17, and he was crying, and trying very hard not to, and Jonas Kerrick, who had every reason on God's earth to knock him into the 7, stood there with his hands at his sides, and did not move. Clemency said, "Sit down, Kit." He sat down on the coal. She said, "How much do we owe you at this minute?" He stared at her. 9 days, ma'am. 4 and 6. "Then I will thank you to work the 9 days out before you go anywhere," she said, "because I cannot spare a pair of hands this week, and I certainly cannot spare the ones that know the mill." Kit Halland opened his mouth and shut it again. Clemency said, "And I want you to understand 2 things. The first is that you have cost this works 11 days and 600 weight of metal, and very possibly the whole of it, and I am not going to pretend otherwise, and you will think about that at intervals for the rest of your life. The second is that a man came into this county and used your mother against you for half a sovereign, and that was not done to you because you are wicked. It was done to you because you are 17 and you have a mother." She turned to go, and then turned back. "And if he comes again," she said, "you will take the half-sovereign, and you will come and tell Mr. Kerrick within the hour, and we will find out what else he wants done." She walked back up the wharf. Behind her she heard Kerrick say something to the boy, quite briefly in a low voice, and she never asked what it was, and Kit Halland never told her. But the boy was at the loam mill at 6 the next morning with his eyes down, and he was still in that yard 19 years later, and by then his name was on the bells. There was now no possibility whatever of 4 bells by the 12th of June, and Clemency Ware sat up the whole of that night in the counting-house, working out what could be done with 3. She had 3, the treble, the 2nd, and the 4th, which had come down its semitone under Ephraim's crank and her ear across 9 days in May, and now stood in the tuning shop with a tierce so clean that the old man had taken to going in and striking it in the evenings for his own pleasure, like a man visiting a garden. 3 bells is not 4 bells. The contract said £400 on the delivery of the first 4. At 6 in the morning she washed her face and put on her good gown, which had been in a press since April, and rode to Marchbourne alone. She was in the vestry at 11, and she said it straight out. 3 bells, not 4. The third had failed at the pour on the 11th. It would be recast on the 21st and delivered in July with the rest, and she asked the chapter to pay £300 on account against the 3 she had brought, and she said she would rather ask it and be refused than dress it up. The dean, who was awake that day, said that this was quite irregular and that the chapter's money was not to be paid out against unperformed contracts, and that he had said in October that the business was hazardous. Dr. Rearsby asked why the bell had failed, and Clemency, who had had 19 miles to think about how she would answer that, and who had decided somewhere near Cleobury that she would not spend the summer being clever, told him the truth, that a man in the Gloucester interest had bribed an apprentice of 17 to put water in her pit, and that she had the boy's account of it, and that she could not prove one word of it against the man, and did not intend to try until she could. There was a silence in the vestry of a very particular kind. Archdeacon Vine said, in his dry voice, "Gloucester, yes," said Clemency. "Rudge," said the Archdeacon. "I did not say so," said Clemency. "No," said the Archdeacon. "You did not." He got up and went to the window with his hands behind his back, and stood there long enough for the dean to say twice that he really did not see what could be done. Then he turned round and said, "The chapter tendered this work in the spring of last year. 2 houses tendered for it. Ferrand of Quatbank at £1,140, and Rudge of Gloucester at 960. We took the dearer, on my motion, because Rudge's grandfather cast the tenor that Miss Ware sat on a chair with her back to in April, and told us had a hole in the middle of it, and I have known that all my life, without knowing that I knew it." He came back to the table. "I move that the chapter pay £300 on account, on the delivery of 3 bells, the same to be deducted in the usual way, and I will add that if this chapter suffers a founder to be broken by an underbidder while she is under contract to us, on our work, having taken our old ring out of our tower on our own vote, then we shall deserve every word that is said about us, and a good deal will be." They paid £300 on the 12th of June. Clemency Ware walked into the Crown at Bridgenorth on the 15th of June at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with Mr. Josiah Quillen on one side of her, and Jonas Kerrick on the other, and put £190 4 shillings and 2pence on the table in front of Gilbert Ferrand in notes and gold, and asked for a receipt. He was a long time writing it. Then he said, without looking up, that she had done better than he had expected, and that she had 4 bells to make and 11 weeks to make them in, and that the tenor of 25 hundredweight was as much metal as the whole of the 3 she had delivered, and that his uncle had never in his life cast a bell above 18. 22, said Kerrick. Ludlow, in 1811. I was on the crook. Gilbert Ferrand blotted the receipt and held it out. "The hearing at Lichfield is the 2nd week of September," he said pleasantly. "I am told the court sits on the 9th. You will be in the middle of your tuning, I dare say. It is a pity they cannot be got to sit in August, but there it is. Rudge's man came back to Kit Halland on the 6th of July at the Fox at Alveley, as Clemency had said he would. He was a civil, tidy, unremarkable man of 40, in a snuff-coloured coat, and he was very pleased with how the third bell had turned out, and he said there was a further half-sovereign to be had, and this time it was not a can of water at all. This time it was a thing of nothing, merely that when they came to strap the cope of the great bell, a certain iron strap should be found to have a flaw in it, and there were 4 such straps lying by the smithy door with a bit of rust on them, and anyone would do. And Kit Halland, who had been coached for 3 weeks by a woman who had once tuned pianofortes for a living, and who had discovered in herself a considerable talent for other things, said that he did not see how he could be expected to do such a thing on nothing but a word, and that he would want it in writing what he was to be paid and what place he was to have at Gloucester after, or he'd not stir. The man laughed at him and told him not to be a fool. Kit said, "Then I'll not do it," and stood up. And the man in the snuff-coloured coat, who had been 6 weeks at this and was being pressed from Gloucester and had a coach to catch, sat down again and wrote him a line on the back of a letter he had in his pocket, promising a place at 11 shillings and the sum of £1 on completion, and signed it S. Rudge per J. Meek, and Kit Halland put it in his shirt and walked 4 miles home in the dark, and put it on the counting-house desk at 10:30 at night in front of Clemency and Carrick and Mr. Quillen's clerk, who happened, by no coincidence at all, to be staying in the house that week. The letter it was written on the back of was a letter from Gilbert Ferrand of Worcester to Silas Rudge of Gloucester, dated the 2nd of May, and it was 3 lines long, and the material sentence was this: "I am satisfied the works will be in my hands by Michaelmas, and I confirm that on that event I am willing to treat with you for the whole concern, plant, patterns, and goodwill, at the figure we discussed at Worcester." Mr. Quillen read it 4 times and then took off his spectacles and said, "Well, well, well, it proves nothing about the water," said Clemency. "It proves nothing whatever about the water," said Mr. Quillen happily, "and it will not be admitted for a moment on the question of the water. And I shall not offer it on the question of the water. I shall offer it on the question of Mr. Gilbert Ferrand's interest and his credit as a witness, and I shall do it on the 9th of September in open court in the presence of the Shrewsbury papers, and I shall enjoy it very much." He put the letter in his pocket-book. "Miss Ware," he said, "make me the bells. I will do the rest." July at Quatbank was the hottest anybody could remember, and they built the great bell in it. The tenor of Marchbourne was to be 25 hundredweight, and to strike A, an octave below the treble, and it was the largest bell that Yard had ever attempted, and it took 11 days to build the core, and 9 to build the false bell, and 14 to build the cope. And through the whole of it, a charcoal fire burned inside the core day and night, so that the pit shed stood at a heat that made men faint. And they worked it in 2 shifts, and Clemency kept the fires with Pigott from midnight to 4, because she found she could sleep in the afternoon, and Pigott could not. She remembered that month for the rest of her life in a series of pictures with no order to them. Carrick and Tarrant swinging the great crook, stripped to the waist in the lantern light, the board going round and round in the wet loam with a sound like a slow tide. Ephraim Boyce asleep, sitting up on a sack with his mouth open and his hand still on a bell. Mrs. Tapp carrying out a wash basket of bread and cold bacon at 2 a.m. in her nightcap, and standing over the men until they ate it. The Severn going down and down in the drought until the wharf steps had 6 feet of stone, showing that nobody had seen since 1811, and Tom Sheldrake saying every single day, with lugubrious satisfaction, that they'd never get the great bell away by water at this rate. And a night at the end of July when she came out of the pit shed at 4 a.m, filthy, with her hair stuck to her forehead, and her arms black to the elbow, and found Jonas Kerrick sitting on the wharf wall in the dark with his forearms on his knees, looking at the river. She sat down beside him because she was too tired to stand. Neither of them said anything for a while. There was a corncrake going in the meadow across the water, and the sky in the northeast had already begun to go grey. Then he said, "I've been meaning to say a thing to you these 3 weeks, and I keep not saying it." Clemency said nothing. "That first night," he said, "in the tuning shop, when I told you to go home and take his £300. He turned his head. "I want you to know I never thought it of you," he said. What he thought, what the nephew's been putting about in Worcester, and what they'll say at Lichfield in September. "I never thought that of you, not that night nor since, and I'd have said so at the time, except I was so full of my own grievance I couldn't see past the end of it. I stood in my own yard and told a woman who'd lost as much as I had that she'd best go home. And then I went in the moulding house and sat down and thought, well, Jonas, that's a fine day's work." He looked back at the river. "I'm not good with saying things," he said. "I'd sooner do a thing than say it, but you've had 4 months of the whole county saying what they like about you, and every man in this yard knows the master left it you because of your ear, and not for any other reason under heaven, and I ought to have been the first to say it out loud, instead of the last." The corncrake went on. Clemency looked at her own hands, which were black, and cracked across the knuckles, and had been a piano tuner's hands in February. She said, "My father used to say that the reason nobody would pay me for my ear was that an ear is not a thing you can show anybody. You can show a man a mended pianoforte. You cannot show him what you heard." She turned round. "You are the only person alive who has ever taken my word for what I heard before I proved it," she said. "Not after. Before, in April, in the tuning shop, with your hand on the bell, when you couldn't hear a thing and you said, 'Say it's there and I'll cut where you say.'" She stopped, because her voice had done something she had not authorized. "I have thought about that," she said, "rather more than I ought." The light was coming up behind the trees, and it was very quiet. Jonas Kerrick did not look at her. He reached over, quite slowly, and took her left hand off her knee and turned it palm up in his own, and looked at it, the split knuckles, the burn on the ball of the thumb from a charcoal fire in June, the callus across the fingers. He put his thumb on the callus. "That wasn't there in February," he said. "No," said Clemency. He held on to her hand, and then Dickon Nash came round the corner of the pit shed with a lantern to say that the core fire was drawing badly on the north side, and Jonas Kerrick let go of her hand and stood up and said, "Right," and went, and neither of them said one word about it for 6 weeks. They cast the tenor on the night of the 11th of August, and the drought broke that afternoon. It came up the valley from the southwest at about 5 o'clock. A bank of iron-colored cloud, with the light going yellow underneath it, and by 7 it was raining on the slates of the pit shed so hard that men had to shout, and the yard ran 3 inches deep, and Tom Sheldrake stood in the doorway and said that they should put it off. They could not put it off. The core fire had been out since the morning, and a dried mold left standing in weather like that begins to take up damp within a day. And there was 1 charge of metal in that furnace, and there would not be coal for another before September. Dick and Nash tapped at 20 minutes past 10. 25 hundredweight of bell metal is a great deal more than twice 11 hundredweight in every way that matters. It goes down the runner with a weight behind it that tries to lift the cope off the core like a lid off a pot, and that is why you strap a cope with iron and wedge the straps and bury the whole thing to the crown in rammed sand, because the sand is not there to hold the mold up, it is there to hold the mold down. The metal ran for 50 seconds and the shed went white, and the rain coming through the louvre above the pit turned to steam in mid-air and hung there, and it was the most beautiful and most frightening thing Clemency Ware ever saw. At 50 seconds, one of the wedges on the north side let go. She did not see it happen. What she saw was Kerrick, who had been standing across the pit with a bar in his hand, put the bar down and go over the edge into the pit on the pouring side, which is a thing no man does, and go down on one knee in the sand 18 inches from a runner full of metal at 1100 degrees, and take up the maul that was lying there and drive a spare wedge into that strap with 4 blows. The last blow was the one that did it. On the third, the metal in the runner, which was standing high and proud and lipping, slopped, no more than a cupful, no more than a splash the size of a hand, and went over the sand and onto his right forearm and his wrist. He did not stop. He drove the 4th blow. Then he came out of that pit, backwards on his heels, with Piggott and Tarrant hauling him by the shoulders, and the first thing he said, on the floor of the shed, with his arm held out from his body and the whole of the yard shouting, was, "Is it standing? Is the cope standing?" It was standing. The great bell of Marchbourne filled and stood and settled and cooled in the ground for 4 days, with the rain coming down on the shed roof, and it came out on the 15th of August without a flaw in it anywhere, 25 hundredweight and 1/4, and it was the best casting anybody in that yard had ever seen or ever would. And Jonas Kerrick spent the whole of it in a bed in the little back room of the dwelling house, with his arm in oil and lint, being looked after by Mrs. Tapp, who had nursed a foundry for 19 years and knew more about burns than the doctor did, and who told Clemency on the first morning, in the passage, in a flat voice, that it was not a bad one as they went, that the metal had run off the arm the way it does off a dry skin instead of sitting, that he would keep the hand and the fingers and the whole use of them, and that there would be a mark from the wrist to the elbow for the rest of his life, and he would not be the first man in that trade to carry one, nor the 10th. Then Mrs. Tapp said, in exactly the same voice, that Miss Ware had best go and sit down before she fell down, and Clemency discovered that she was holding on to the door frame with both hands. He was in that bed 9 days, and he was the worst patient in Shropshire. She sat with him in the evenings because there was nobody else to do it, and because the yard could not be at a stand, and somebody had to tell him what had been done. And so from the 11th of August to the 20th she came in at 9 o'clock with a candle, and gave him the day's account, the bell out, the sand cleared, the 6th strapped, the 7th drawn, the carriage of the tenor to be by water if the river came up, and by road on 12 horses if it did not. Ephraim 2/3 through the treble, Kit doing the mill of 3 men. On the 6th evening he said, "Out of nowhere, I want you to release me from the 7 years." Clemency put the candle down. He was sitting up against the bolster with his arm across a pillow, and he was looking at the ceiling. "I have thought about it a good while lying here," he said, "and it comes out the same every way. He tied me to this yard for 7 years, and he tied it so I can't be got rid of and can't be starved out, and at the time I thought he did it for my sake. He did not. He did it for yours. He knew you couldn't run a foundry alone, and he knew no man in the trade would come to a woman's works, so he took the only man who couldn't leave and nailed him to the floor of it. He turned his head, and it worked," he said. "Here I am. And in September that court will sit, and Quillen will put in his letter, and I think we shall keep the place, and then it's Michaelmas and the bells go up. And then what?" Clemency did not answer. "Then I am your foreman on 28 shillings for 6 years and a bit," he said, "and every man between here and Gloucester will say what he likes about the pair of us, and there'll not be one of them says it because he's wicked. They'll say it because I am in your house and in your yard, and I am bound to you by a paper, and there is no way in this world for me to prove I stopped for any reason but the paper. Not to them. Not to you," he said, "and I find I mind that a great deal more than I minded losing the works." The candle guttered. Clemency said, "What would you do?" "Go to Bewdley to my sister," he said, "and take a wage at the ironworks till Michaelmas 12-month, and come back when there's no paper on me." "And this yard would be at a stand from September," said Clemency, "and the will says that if the works is found idle within 7 years and no bell in the pit, it goes over to your friend in Worcester, the same as if we had failed at Michaelmas. So the release you are asking me for is the one thing his nephew wants more than the bond." There was a silence. Carrick said quietly, "I had not got that far." "No," said Clemency. She got up and went to the window and stood with her back to him and looked out at the yard, where the pit shed lantern was still burning at 9 at night, because Ephraim Boyce would not go to bed. She said, "I am going to say something now, and I shall only say it once, and then I am going to go out of this room, and we are neither of us going to speak of it again until the 29th of September. Because if we speak of it again before then, we shall make bad bells." She turned round. "You think you cannot prove why you stopped," she said. "You can. You went into that pit." He started to say something, and she went on. "There is a paper that binds you to be head moulder at Ferrens for 7 years. There is no paper in England that binds a man to go over the edge of a pit on a pouring night with a maul in his hand. That is not in the indenture, and it is not in the will, and it is not in 28 shillings a week, and there is not one man in 100 who would have done it, and every soul in that yard saw you do it, and so did I." Her voice was not perfectly steady, and she did not much care. "So do not tell me you cannot prove why you stopped, Mr. Carrick. You have proved it. You have got a mark on your arm from the wrist to the elbow, and you will carry it for 50 years, and I shall look at it for 50 years, and I shall know exactly what it says." She picked up the candle. At the door she stopped. "And when this is done," she said, "and the bells are up, and there is no bond and no court and no nephew, you will ask me your question in a garden somewhere like a Christian, and I shall give you your answer, and it will not have anything to do with a paper." Then she went out and shut the door. Jonas Carrick lay in the dark for a long time with his arm on the pillow, and, according to Mrs. Tapp, who had been listening on the landing from about the third sentence, and who told Clemency so 20 years later with no shame whatever, laughed once, quietly, some time after midnight. The tuning took 26 days, and it very nearly cost them the 7th bell. It is done on the vertical machine. The bell is bolted mouth up to the chuck plate, and the plate turns, and a hardened tool on a slide rest is fed in against the inside of the metal, and it takes off a shaving the width of a ribbon and the thickness of a hair, and the shaving comes away blue and hot and smelling of hot pennies, and the note of the bell goes down by an amount you cannot see and can only hear. You can go down. You can never come back. Ephraim Boyce stood at that crank for 26 days, and Clemency Ware sat on a stool 8 feet away with her father's forks on the bench beside her. And the whole of that time they worked the way she had worked with her father at 9 years old. He cut and stopped and knocked the bell with the ball of a hammer, and she said one word, and he cut again. More, stop. Take it at the lip, not the waist. The nominal wants a shade, and nothing else does. Stop. Twice a day Carrick came in with his arm in a sling and put his good hand flat on the metal while it sounded, and by the 2nd week he could tell them. Before Clemency spoke, whether the third was swimming, and the first time he did it, Ephraim Boyce took his hands off the crank and walked out of the shop and stood in the yard for a while with his back to the door. The 7th bell went wrong on the 9th of September. It went wrong because Clemency was not there. She was at Lichfield, in the consistory court, in her good gown, sitting on a bench for 6 hours, while a barrister engaged by Gilbert Ferrand invited a series of people to agree that Ambrose Ferrand had been a strange and failing old man, and that a manufactory worth £2,000 had been left to a young woman of no family, whom he had met once. And while another barrister engaged by Mr. Josiah Quillen called Mrs. Elizabeth Tapp, who had kept that house 19 years, and who stated in the flattest voice in Shropshire that her master had kept his accounts in his own hand to the week he died, had beaten the Bridgenorth Bank's manager at chess in November, had told her in October precisely what he meant to do and why, and had said to her at the time, and she gave it in his words, which she had not forgotten, "I am not leaving it to a woman, Bess. I am leaving it to an ear, and the county may say what it likes when I am past hearing it." And then Mr. Quillen's man produced a 3-line letter dated the 2nd of May from the plaintiff to a rival founder at Gloucester, offering to sell the whole concern the moment it should fall in, and asked the plaintiff whether he had mentioned that arrangement to the court, and the shorthand writer wrote down the answer, and the Shrewsbury Chronicle printed the whole exchange on the 13th under the heading, "A Singular Suit at Lichfield." The will was pronounced for on the 11th of September, but on the 9th, at Quat Bank, with Clemency 19 miles away, Ephraim Boyce had stood at his machine in front of the 7th bell, and had done what he had done for 51 years, which was to trust his hands, and his hands had told him it wanted 24 thousandths more off the sound bow, and he had taken it. She heard it the moment she came into the shop on the 10th. She did not even put her bonnet down. She said, "Oh, Ephraim," he said, "I know it. I knew it Tuesday night. I've not been to bed." The nominal had gone under. Not much, she made it 1/5 of a semitone, the very fault she had found in the master's 4th bell in February, come round again like a debt. But it was under, and it could not be brought back. And the 7th of a ring of 8 with a flat nominal is a bell that will lean on the 6th for 100 years. They had 19 days. There was no metal for a new 7th, and no coal and no time, and Clemency Ware sat down on the stool in the tuning shop and put her face in her hands for about 90 seconds, which was as long as she permitted herself. Then she got up and said, "Then we shall take the 6th down to meet it." "The 6th, said Kerrick, "and the 5th after it, and the 8th, and the tenor last," said Clemency. "All of them down by the same. We did it once in May with the master's 4th. We shall do it again with 4 bells in 19 days, and the ring will stand 1/5 of a semitone flat of the drawing, and it will be a true ring. And there is not a man in that chapter, nor in that parish, nor in England who will ever know it, because a ring is not judged against a fork, it is judged against itself." Ephraim Boyce said, in a cracked voice, "It's my fault, and I'll not have you cut 4 bells for me." "And Clemency," said Misty Boyce, "you have cut 140 bells for a man who could not hear the last 20 of them, and you have never once been told what you were doing right. I am not cutting them for you. I am cutting them because there are 8 bells in this shop, and 7 of them have to fit the 8th, and it happens to be that one. Get on the crank." They finished the tenor at 11 at night on the 24th of September. They took the bells to Marchbourne on the 26th on 4 wagons, by road, because the river was still low, 12 horses on the tenor, and the wheels sunk to the felloes going up out of Cleobury, and Tom Sheldrake walking at the leader's head the whole 19 miles, and complaining without a break, and every village they passed through turning out to stand at the gates and look. They hung them on the 27th and the 28th, with the ringers of St. Michael's doing half the work, and Prue the miller up in the frame with his coat off. And on Michaelmas Day, the 29th of September 1823, at 11 o'clock in the morning, the Dean and Chapter of Marchbourne, and 1,100 parishioners, and about 400 people who had come in from 6 parishes round, stood in and about the churchyard of St. Michael, and the 6 ringers of St. Michael's, who had voted against the whole business, to a man, in April, rang the new ring of 8 up into rounds for the first time. Clemency Ware stood at the back, by the lick gate, in the same place she had stood in April. The treble went first, and the second, and the third, and she heard them all separately, and then she stopped being able to, because by the 4th stroke the whole 8 were going, and it was not 8 notes any more. It was one thing, and the tenor came in under it at the end of every row, 2,500 weight of new metal, with the old tenor of 1710 melted into the middle of it, and it had a 3rd in it, and the 3rd sat still, and the whole was gone. She did not cry in the churchyard. She had determined on that for weeks, and she kept to it. She got as far as the field beyond the wall, where the elms are, and then she stopped and put both hands over her face, and stood there, while the bells went on and on behind her, and she thought about a hot day in a churchyard at Much Wenlock in 1815, and an old man in a brown coat crouching down to be level with a girl's face. And she said out loud to a man who had been 8 months dead, There now, you may go to sleep." There was a step behind her on the stubble. She did not turn round, and Jonas Carrick did not say anything, and after a moment he took his coat off and put it round her shoulders, and stood beside her, and they listened to the bells together until they were rung down at 11:45. Then he said, "You told me to ask you in a garden." "This is a field," said Clemency. "It's the nearest I can get to a garden inside 2 miles, he said, "and I've been waiting since the 11th of August, and I've got a mark on my arm from the wrist to the elbow, and you said you'd know what it said." Clemency Ware turned round and looked up at him. "Ask me, then," she said. The chapter paid the balance of the contract on the 2nd of October, £740, less the allowance for the old metal, which came to more than they had reckoned, because the old tenor had weighed 19 hundredweight, and not 17. They were married at Quat in the 2nd week of November by the Archdeacon, who came 19 miles in a gig to do it, and said it was the only wedding he had ever performed at which the bride corrected the tenor of the parish church in the vestry afterwards. Aunt Prudence Ware came from Shrewsbury, and lived at the works for the remaining 11 years of her life, in the room over the counting-house, and could tell every man in that yard by his step on the flags before he had come 3 yards. Farron's Bell Works of Quatbank cast 4 bells in 1824, 9 in 1825, and never fewer than 14 in any year after that, until 1841, and the reason was the ring at Marchbourne and Archdeacon Vine's tongue, and a letter that Dr. Rearsby wrote to the Gentleman's Magazine in 1824, describing a ring of 8 in Shropshire in which, he said, the thirds sat still. Silas Rudge of Gloucester gave up bell-founding in 1831 and went into brass cocks and valves. Gilbert Farrand paid his own costs and his uncle's estate's costs, and sold the wine business in Worcester in 1826, and was never again mentioned at Quatbank by anybody, which was, in the end, the harshest thing that could have happened to him. Ephraim Boyce cut his last bell in 1829 at 79, with his hands under a woman's ear, and died the following spring in the room he had slept in for 58 years. And it was Kit Halland who cut after him. And Kit Halland, who was taken into the firm in 1842 when the name over the gate was changed to read Carrick and Halland, Bellfounders, late Farrand. And in 1826 Jonas Carrick went to Shrewsbury on a Tuesday without saying what he went for, and came back on the Thursday on a wagon with a square Broadwood pianoforte of 1804, with a rosewood case and a cracked bridge, which he had bought back from a corn factor's wife in Frankwell for £9, and the promise of a christening bell. And it stood in the parlour of the dwelling-house at Quatbank for the rest of both their lives, and it was, everybody agreed, the best tuned instrument in the county, though very few people were ever allowed to hear it.